pleasure to introduce to you Diego Golombek. Diego, Veronica, and I were in college together back years ago. Diego, when Diego was actually a year ahead of ours in college, so we actually met on the second or third year classes. And Diego's really, a brilliant person, as you will see by all the stories that I'm going to tell you about. But it's really interesting because, by the time I met Diego, we were about 19 years old, he had already been a journalist. He started his career as a communicator, as a journalist in Buenos
Okay. Well, let me know if there's anything you need me to do.
Can you please mute yourself? Thank you. So anyway, what was really amazing is that he was a journalist in English. This was the only English published newspaper, with a big print, impact in Buenos Aires, and he was a sports reporter there. No, not that he's a great sportsman, but anyway, I'll tell you about the rest. So anyway, when we actually started studying today, Diego was fluent in English, not only reading, writing, and speaking English, but he had also studied music. Actually, he graduated from one of the top conservatories in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and so he's an extremely good guitar player. He plays the flute, the piano, and he was also, while we were in college, a theater director, right? So I'm and in fact, when we were students, he directed a few plays, and he's continuing with that. In fact, the last script that he wrote is for an opera, which is called Darwin in Patagonia, and it opened at Yale only like 3 months ago, and we're going to try to bring it here. It's the story of Darwin, not only traveling to Patagonia, but also on his way back trying to civilize, quote unquote, these native Argentinians that they took to the UK in order to become good citizens, which is a totally failed experiment, obviously. So anyway, then, the last week he sent me another script from a play that he wrote, and I just can't keep up with him. I didn't read it yet, so sorry. On top of that, Diego has been a really accomplished scientist. He has more than 200 papers in the area of circadian rhythms. And actually, we were together in the same lab when we were undergrads, and that's where we started studying together circadian rhythms and sleep. And in fact, approaching now our retirement now, we still are collaborating. And in fact, Diego and Leandro sitting there and Wada are all part of a big, and several other people in the lab of a big NIH grant that funds our research with indigenous communities in Argentina, but we have parallel studies here in Seattle, so it's become a super profitable collaboration in which we're doing simultaneous studies that are synergistic, and it's been great to be able to do that. In the last maybe 20 years, Diego has become kind of obsessed with communicating science, to the point that he's written at least 20 books of popular science in Argentina. And not only that, because he was not happy with that alone, he created his own series of popular science, and he has edited already over 100 books of that series, right? So this is a publishing company that has only a dedicated series that is edited by Diego. And these books are sold all over Latin America, Spain, and other Spanish-speaking areas. So with that, it's a great honor to introduce you to Diego, and he's going to talk today about how to communicate science, which is something that I think we should all learn a little bit more about. There we go.
Well, thank you, Horacio. Thank you, everybody, for coming. But he forgot to say that he's my mom. So that's why he has the script. So it's wonderful to be here. I mean, Horacio and Veronica have been here for too long, and I haven't visited. This is my first visit, so I'm really happy about knowing the lab and the family and everything, and all of you. And it's been a great time, actually, just 2 days, but I've met lots of people, and we've discussed science and things like that. But as Horacio was saying, my other hat is in science communication, which I think it should be my other hats, which should be just one. We should all have both type of professions. So let me start with a thesis, right? With a sentence that I don't know if you'll agree with, which is that science communication is science. It's part of science, and not everybody agrees with this. So, and you're entitled, actually, right? For some people, this of course is from the art of war, right? Politics is a continuation of war through other means. For some scientists, this is not true. One thing is science, and then maybe if I have time, I'll do some communication or whatever. My thesis is that it's not that way. Communicating in science is part of being a scientist. And again, not everybody agrees with this. And I believe that part of that, not everybody agrees with this, is that we have a bit of a confusion between two terms here. I'm talking about science communication and not research communication, right? There's something I learned from one of my mentors in science communication, an Argentinian, very well-known cell biologist, Marcelino Cerejido, who's very old now. By the way, he mentioned something about now that we are close to retirement, right? Speak for yourself. Actually, this is usually confused, right? I'm going to talk about communicating science, or at least for this talk, I want to differentiate between science and research. Communicating research is what journalism does. They communicate news about science, and it's the type of news that it always starts the same way. A group of scientists, a group of scientists from the University of whatever has a CH, Massachusetts, Chicago, whatever, that's communicating research, news about research. What I'm trying to talk about is communicating science, right? Which is a view of the world, and we all agree on this, but the audience does not necessarily agree on this. So my definition of science here is
Yes.
one. Science is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yes, it is.
Fine, I'm on a Zoom.
Okay, don't worry, it's okay. And again, this is not
Ask me a quick question, and I'll try to help you.
This is something quite far away from most of the audience, but I want to convince people, including scientists, that it's part of what we do. And of course,
Yeah, for the meeting.
this definition is of a very well-known scientist, this guy, right? on his very last album, dedicated a song to his son, Sean, beautiful boy, incredible song, by the way. And he says something which is very, life is what happens to you. We all agree on that, right? Life happens. Well, science happens too, but people don't agree on that. And that's our first step towards science communication, making people agree that science is part of their lives. Right? And there are many ways of demonstrating that people don't agree on this. One is a very old experiment that is happening all over the world since the 70s, I believe, which is, it's not the Imagine a Scientist, it's the Draw a Scientist test, which many of you probably know, right? It's a test that happens in kindergarten with 5 or 6 year old kids, and they ask them to draw somebody that works in science, right? And usually, if I do that with you, it will be probably the same, right? Still now, 50 years after when the experiment started, people think about the usual cartoon of a scientist, a male probably with a lab coat, with glasses. We are all myopic, and with some, I don't know, some flies on their head because we never wash properly, whatever. So this is what people think about scientists. And we have to start with this. If people think that scientists is what we are, well, we are wrong. This is not what most of our audiences think all over the world. This test is amazing, the Draw Scientist test. It was proposed by David Chambers in the late 60s, and it was published properly in the 80s. There's something very good about this test. It is changing, right? The depiction of scientists in this test in the very last years has changed. There are quite a few females. The last one, I think that it was a few years ago, there was a 30% of female scientists. When the kids draw somebody, it's 30%. It's not the best, but we are getting there. And why are we getting there? Because of communication, right? The way people see science is that they see it through the lens of communicators. They might be institutional communicators, like the press office of a university or institution. They might be journalists. They might be us when we go out of the lab and tell the things that we do. But this thing about the division between science and the rest of the world is not new. It's something that was started probably by this guy. This guy was Charles Percy Snow. He was a physicist, actually, but he was very known as a writer, a science fiction writer. And he gave a lecture in 1959, which was called The Two Cultures. And for Snow, the two cultures were the scientific culture and the humanistic culture. And he proposed back then that they could not talk to each other. But there was a division between the humanities and the sciences. And actually, the kind of examples he gave were not the best, probably. But he would say that a scientist, somebody coming from the scientific pole, could enjoy Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, while somebody coming from the humanities could not enjoy the second principle of thermodynamics, which we all know is very enjoyable, right? And he had something. He was really exaggerating on the point that there are two poles of culture, but he wasn't exaggerating that much. Let me show you a couple of examples that he wasn't exaggerating that much. One of the examples comes from this guy, one of my favorite writers, probably yours too, Edgar Allan Poe. He hated science. He was really against science, probably because the only book that sold out while Poe was alive was a book on science. It was a book on mollusks that he had to write for a publisher. He had no idea about it. He just wrote whatever they dictated him, but his stories or his poems were not sold and nobody knew him. And this is one of his early poems called A Sonnet to Science. Take a look at this, right? Science, daughter of old time, you alter all things with your peering eyes, right? Why prayest thou thus upon the poet's heart, vulture who swings under realities? How should he, the poet, love you? Or how do the wise who would not leave him in his wandering to seek for treasure in the jeweled skies, right? It's a very poetic language, but what he's saying is that the language of science, the way in which we take a look at the world, takes all beauty out of the world, right? Takes all magic out of the world. And that's what people really think. We don't, because we live from this, we're enthusiastic, we are passionate about this. But our audience really thinks that if you go and explain something, well, it takes all the magic out of it. And our task is to convince them that it is really magical, that it's really beautiful. And another example, very well known because of a book by Richard Dawkins, which is called Unweaving the Rainbow. It also comes from a poem, a very well-known poem by John Keats, quite dull, it's very boring as a poem, but what he says is that philosophy, science by other name, philosophy will clip an angel's wing, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and known mind, and weave a rainbow. So that's our task for the audience, or for a poet at least. We unweave rainbows. When we explain what a rainbow is, we take all the magic out of it. And if we don't accept that, that's what our audience thinks, then we won't even start to communicate. Because we'll say, well, this is wonderful, this is amazing, look at this. And people don't care about it. And we think they do. And it's wrong, because when we think they do, we are putting them ourselves on top of the rest of the audience, and I'll talk more about that. And if there are two cultures between science and the rest of the world, what happens with technology? Well, again, a quote by another writer, by Arthur Clarke, which you probably know, writer of 2001 and so forth, a very famous quote, actually, that technology, advanced technology, is magic. Of course it is. Of course it is. Why do I press a key here and it goes up and down? Hey, it's magic. Look, yay. I have no idea. It is magic, really, for all of us and for the audience as well. This is part of the 3 rules by Arthur Clarke. They're very good. That's why I want to share them with you. The other laws is when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he's almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he's probably wrong. Isn't it great? For all scientists like Horacio, that applies, right? Which he's about to retire, and then he heard about that. And the other one is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. Those are the 3 rules by Clarke. I want to focus on this one, which is true, right? Technology is really magic. So what can we do? Or what should we do? What can we as scientists do? Lots of things, okay? First one is my thesis, right? Consider that communicating science is part of science. It's part of our job. It's not something that we do when we have free time or whenever a journalist calls us or whatever. And again, not everybody agrees on that. And it's fine, we can discuss that, but that's my thesis at least, okay? The second one, right? Why don't we do it? Because we're not being evaluated by that. I mean, nobody cares. They care about papers, which is fine, patents or whatever, but not if we write a book or give an interview or whatever, right? So we need to change that. I'm not meaning that should deserve points like a paper or whatever, but it should be on our reports. And at least in our country, I'm coming from the South, I'm from Argentina, this is not on our annual reports or so forth. So that's something that needs to change. What else can we do? Well, participate in the old and ancient fight between good and evil, which is science and journalism, right? We don't like each other, right? Whenever a scientist agrees for an article or an interview, he or she will believe that the journalist will say the opposite of what they mean, right? And for the journalist, the scientist is somebody who talks nonsense and wants the article back before it's published, right? That's the way they see us, right? So we need to change that. Fortunately, we have wonderful science writers, right? But we need to change this collaboration between science and the media. What else should we do? Go to the community. Some of us do, some of you do for sure. Go to schools, go to the club, go to a bar or whatever to talk to your friends about science, right? And this is not something that we usually do. And of course, if Horacio invites us to give a seminar at UW, we have to come, and we are very happy about that, right? So let's go again. So about the two cultures, there are lots of things we need to think about. Where do they start? When do they start? In terms of history, in terms of the ages of our audience, and so forth. For example, you might want to know, what do kids think about science? There's a wonderful researcher called Jonathan Osborne. He's British, I believe he's now at the University of California. And he runs many surveys about this. This is one of them. And he asks people in many countries, these are pre-high school, so something like 12-year-old kids, if they like science in school more than other subjects. And this is the answer. Don't take a look at the countries here, just at the points, right? This is a Likert scale, sorry. And the more to the right is they like science more than other subjects. Can you see that there are two clusters? Right? They're clearly one to the right, one to the left. If you don't see this, don't see it. You're seeing, right? Don't see which would be these countries and which would be these countries. What do you think? Which would be these that are farther to the right? Exactly, they're underdeveloped. And it's not that easy to think about it. You would think that, I mean, more developed countries will make kids more fond of science. And it's the opposite way, right? It's African countries, some Latin American countries, and so forth. They're more to the right. And the other thing is that these are the European countries, more developed countries, are more to the left. So that means that here we have a wonderful opportunity. And I say that because I come from one of those countries, maybe not as poor as some African countries, but really underdeveloped. And we have a wonderful opportunity here. The other thing, and this was from the early 2000s, is that you have blue and red circles. Those are boys and girls. And if you just take a look at the data by itself, of course, the boys like science more. Well, this depends a lot on the way you ask the question, right? If you ask it like this, do you like science more than other subjects? There is a little bit, I'm not sure if it's significant, but there's a little bit of the boys going more to the right, meaning liking science more. But then if you divide the question on what kind of science it is, it's all over the place, right? So if it has to do with something that makes a lot of noise, smells badly or whatever, the boys really love it. But if it's hypothesis driven and you have to think about what's going to happen, well, usually girls like it more than boys. So this is a very interesting way of looking at the two cultures. When does it start? When do we divorce ourselves from thinking scientifically? And the other, well, this is the explanation of it, right? Then you can go to general populations. Again, this is very little, but on purpose, right? This, again, is the trust in science and this is very recent. This is from 2024, I believe. And again, there might be, if this is the median, no, this is the mean, not the median, sorry. The mean, there are some countries that tend to be to the right and some countries that tend to be to the left of the average in terms of trust in science. It's not as clear as what happens with the kids, but usually the ones that are more to the right are the underdeveloped countries. So it gives us a wonderful opportunity, right? If our countries, my country and some others are the ones that tend to trust more in science, well, we could turn that into public policy. And the other thing also by Osborne is he ran another survey asking professional scientists, when did you decide to be a scientist? So I'm asking you, do you remember when you decided that your life was going to be related to science? What age were you? More or less, yeah. 8th grade, which means what age? Yeah, okay. What else? Around what age? Okay, take a look at what he found. I don't remember the end here. Just look at the percentage, right? Most of the scientists, 35%, or thirds here, answered between 12 and 14. And this is amazing for doing policies for public communication of science. Public communication of science is usually aimed at young kids. If you go to science museums, for example, they are all for very, very young kids, or for the ones that are finishing high school, because that's the time when we believe that they want to go into science or not. But we do almost nothing, at least in what I know, for 12-year-old kids or 14-year-old kids, right? So it's a miracle that they go into science, right, after, because this is when they might decide, and we are not doing the right science communication there. Let's go back to science communication. And let's go for a little history of science communication. Actually, it started very earlier. There are Babylonian museums that are supposed to be the first one that showed scientific objects. But there's some of the very interesting. For example, this article in Nature in 1894 by a very well-known writer called Horace Wells, Invisible Man and so forth. He was a biologist, Wells, right? A natural scientist, let's say. And this is a review from The Origin of Species by Darwin, right? It was actually the 4th or 5th edition of Darwin's book. And he says, the acknowledged leaders of the great generation that is now passing away, Darwin, address themselves in many cases to the general reader rather than to their colleagues. Instead of current or popular yet philosophical books increasing, its volume is anything to dwindle. So he was worried by the end of the 19th century that scientists were not talking to people, but to their colleagues, right? In some cases, it was not like this. And one of the most well-known examples is Röntgen's experiment of X-rays. And you know that before publishing it on a regular journal, he sent it to Die Presse, to the German newspaper. And it was on the front of the newspaper, and he became a rock star, actually, out of this. And then it was accepted in whatever, Science, Nature. So you know what to do with your next paper. Don't send it to Science or Nature, send it to the newspaper. And if it gets to the front page, well, maybe you have some opportunities. Other than that, there's another history. When did the two cultures start, actually? And it's a fascinating history. In the 19th century, Darwin, the famous chemists, and so forth, there were no two cultures. Anybody with an average education would know what was going on with science, right? And they would be very interested about knowing what was going on with science. And there are wonderful examples, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein comes from her knowing what was going on with Galvani and Volta and the electrophysiologists of the time, right? They knew what was going on. In the 20th century, things changed, right? Science started to divide from the people, to move away from what anybody could understand, probably because of physics, because of contemporary physics, relativity, quantum physics, and so forth. They were not available for the general audience. And something else happens in the 20th century, very important for science communication, which is the Cold War, right? In the 50s, maybe early 60s, the Cold War was also fought on the scientific and technological front, right? And the Soviet Union was winning, really winning, I mean, lots of Sputnik satellites and so forth. And there was a political decision here in the US that they needed more scientists, and for having more scientists, they needed more science communication, right? It's a very well-known story. there is a report called the Vannevar-Bush report, right, which it says exactly that. We need more scientists, we need more engineers, we need our young kids to get into science. So we need professional science communication. And the big names of professional science communicators come after that, right? Let me show a few of them. This guy, Jacob Bronowski, I don't know if you know the guy, is amazing, amazing. There's a whole documentary, which is all on YouTube, actually. He was funded by federal money to do science communication. Of course, Carl Sagan, that I'm going to talk more about him later. Isaac Asimov, quite a character. Stephen Jay Gould, younger than the other ones, but he also received some money for doing science communication in evolution in this case. This guy, a very strange history, Martin Gardner, very well-known communicator of mathematics, and he started a way of communicating mathematics that was very popular, starting in Scientific American and then going to national newspapers and so forth. My hero, of course, Oliver Sacks. Very different story, but the same generation, right? You need to tell the people what science is about. Another character, contemporary, Richard Dawkins, not from the US, but also falling within the same age and the same era. And maybe we could add Paul Davis, Australian communicator, very well known for astronomy communication, right? So this is not random, right? This happened because there was a decision that we need to communicate science, because if not, we would fall behind in the technological and scientific war, which was happening in the 50s and 60s. So then came another question. How should we call this? How should we call this career, this job of telling science stories, right? And I find it a fascinating question, because defining your job tells a lot about your job. So we have many ways of defining what we do, right? I talked about scientific journalism, the people that tell news about science. In English, most people talk about science popularization. They sometimes use the Latin name divulgatio, which is also popularization. And if you think about the theory of communication, all of these have something in common, right? It has a single direction, from where knowledge is produced to the people that don't know, right? We have to popularize. You have to tell the people, the popolo in Latin. We have to divulgar in Spanish, which is also from Latin, which is tell el vulgo, the people, right? There is another word which we don't usually use, which is communication. What's the root of communication? Communication is also from Latin, communicare, put in common, right? And it's completely different. Let's suppose that you want to rate the success of a popularization program. What are you going to do? You're going to look at the books, the articles, the TV shows, and whatever. Now you're looking at the success of a communication program. You're going to see at what the people think about it. So it's completely different. Just changing one word is really different. And actually, this three that have to do with the people that know, the scientists, and the people that do not know have a proper name in science communication studies. It's called the deficit model, right? This is something that people that work in communication use a lot. And actually, for the discipline of science communication, the monster is the deficit model. Why deficit? Because it assumes that some people know and are up here, and some people don't know. So when we talk about science popularization, don't we use that kind of metaphor? We talk about translating science, right? Because it has to be translated for people that don't know. In Spanish, it would be bajar, so lower down the language of science. Again, I'm not assuming that we want to change the way we talk, but whenever we talk about how do we name this, there's a theory behind it, right? And it's not the only way of thinking about science communication. This is a quadrant from a very recent paper of different models in science communication. This is the deficit, right? The expert and the people. And the expert fills the gaps that the people don't know. But again, you can have a contextual model. Okay, you do have an expert, but it's within a context. It's not the same in different cultures, in different geographies, in different people, right? The opposite of the deficit model could be the lay expertise model, where everything is the same. It's a relativistic model, right? So the lay people is as entitled as the expert to talk about science, right? It's the opposite. I don't agree that much with that one, but it's another of the models. And maybe the most complete one is the participation model, which is the one that is being used in science museums, actually. I don't know if you have been involved in any science exhibition. It's very different the way that they are designed and curated these days. Of course, they talk to the scientists, as many as possible, but they talk to the people. What do you know about this? What do you want to know? How do you want to know it? How do you want to be involved with this exhibition? And those are the most successful exhibitions in Science Museum, which are the ones that deal with the participation model. However, the deficit model is not dead. I mean, we still think about it, and it has something that we don't believe in when we do science. It is called the authority principle. The authority principle means that something is true or not, depending on who is saying that. This is true because a Nobel Science winner is saying that, or my boss, or my mom, or whatever. That's the authority principle. The deficit model assumes the authority principle. This is true because the scientist is saying that. And that's not right. We know that. We as scientists know that. This is not true because this big shot in science is saying that. It is true because they demonstrate that, and you can come in and say, well, the method is not right, maybe we should change this. And that's not what we communicate. We communicate things from up here. We use the deficit model. And I'm not sure if we should use this deficit model. So if we agree that calling a job has something to do with the way we do it, let's go back to telling stories, right? Another analogy of telling stories in science communication comes from a French guy, right? This guy here, actually, Pierre Fayard. He wrote a book on science journalism, actually, and there's a chapter on the book called "So Where Are the Cossacks?" Right? And he talks about when Napoleon wanted to invade Russia, right? So what did he do? He got together a very, very huge army, so he could go and invade Russia and conquer Russia as fast as possible. So when he crossed the borders, no one was there. That's why, where are the Cossacks? Because what they did was they kept him every now and then with little battles until winter came, and of course, Napoleon could not invade Russia. So what Fayard is saying is that when we communicate science, we use the same tactics. We gather together the most formidable army that has existed, science. And we go with the torch of science to evangelize people. This is science, and nobody's there. Nobody wants to be evangelized. I don't know about yourselves, right? Nobody wants to receive the knowledge from above. So it's not a good strategy, right? It's the usual Mohammed and the mountain, right? This is in Spanish, sorry, it's hi mountain, it's me, Mohammed, I'm waiting for you, or you're not coming, I'm coming, okay? And that's what we have to do as science communicators, right? Not expect the audience to come to us because they won't, right? We have to go there and understand their needs, the same as when we receive information from other disciplines in science. We don't want the technical jargon, we don't want the details, we want the questions. What are you so passionate about? Why do you go running to your lab every morning? And that's what we need to tell, because people will feel empathic about that. And this has to do with a prepositional approach, right? I don't know prepositions in English, but it's something like this, right? What do we put between science and the world? What kind of preposition do we use to communicate with the world? And it will be very different if we use any of those, because it's a different approach to science communication. What if we talk about science about the world, or around the world, or besides, or for the world, or and the world? It's a different attitude that we have. And talking about the world, of course, this has different meanings in different places. There are different schools of communicating science. There's the British school, which is the oldest, and they had the Royal Society as the first scientific society, and one of the first activities that they had was science popularization conferences that are still going on now, like the Christmas conferences, like the Faraday candle conference, and so forth. So they really started this, right? Then you have some nationalistic schools of communication, like the French one. If you read a French book on science popularization, on popular science, all of the heroes are French. I don't know how they manage, right? But maybe there is a Newton, but that's all they can have, right? So I'm using French as an example, but many of the schools are nationalistic. We only care about what happened in our region, in our country. As I told you, the US school has a starting point, a political starting point. We need more scientists. We need to do science communication. Then there is something that we could call the Latin American School of Science Communication. It's also political, ideological. It has to do with the 60s, or the 1960s actually, 1960s, 1970s, when there were several revolutions in Latin America, part of which had to do with science and with science communication. I won't go into that a lot. And some of the things have proper names, right? Some effect names. For example, there is the Sagan effect. The Sagan effect in science communication studies talks about scientists that are very popular, extremely popular, and the community doesn't like them, right? Sagan was not allowed into the National Academy of Science. And if you read the report, why he wasn't allowed, it's nonsense. What they're saying, you want to be famous? Okay, not here, not with us. Right? So this is something that happens to some scientists that become very popular and their community doesn't like that. Another interesting effect that has a proper name is the Hawking effect. Because of Stephen Hawking, of course, which was very famous because he appeared not once, not twice, but 3 times on The Simpsons. And the 3rd time, Homer says, oh no, that damn cripple again. Isn't it wonderful to receive Stephen Hawking? It's amazing. What is the Hawking effect? You know, there's a book by Stephen Hawking called A Brief History of Time from 1980. It was a worldwide bestseller, and it's unreadable. I mean, if you're not a physicist, it's completely ununderstandable. But everybody would go with the book on their arm with the cover towards you. I mean, look what I'm reading, you know? And nobody understands why some pieces of science communication become massive. So some people study that and try to understand why is it? Is it because of the character, because of Hawking, because of the area, or whatever? And another effect that has a proper name is the Asimov effect, which is that whoever communicates science has to know about everything. And it has happened to you, for sure. Oh, so you work with birds. So then why is the owl? What? I have no idea. And people expect that. And Asimov is the most important representative of that. You know, he wrote about physics, chemistry, biology, the Bible, whatever you want, robots, and so forth. So people talk about this, and there are papers about the effects, the Sagan, Hawking, or Asimov effects. The other thing that people quarrel a lot about is who is entitled for science communication, who should tell science stories. And then, I mean, the two main armies here are journalists, right? Because they know about communication. And on the other side, you have the people that say, no, it has to be scientists because they know about science, right? The bad thing is that in schools of communication, there's seldom, if any, a course on science, right? And I've taught in communication schools, so I know about this. And you know that in science schools, there are no communication courses. So if you want to go into this, you have to look somewhere else. So we have a hybrid. The hybrid is a communicator, right? The one that is trained from both sides and is kind of entitled for science stories, right? Of course, journalists and scientists are very welcome, but we need this hybrid. And we are not constructing this hybrid in universities, for example, right? There are no schools for science communicators in university. There are schools for journalism or for science. And I believe that we should do that. And actually, this is from a Spanish guy, that he's asking himself, should we talk about science communicators or scientist communicators? So is it us that need to do the real communication as scientists, or is it somebody trained somewhere else? Well, we could talk about that later. Okay, I'll go over this. I'm saying this about science communication as if it were easy, right? As if we would go and tell our friends or families what we do, and they say, wow, I love that. No, they won't say that, right? Why? Why is it so difficult and so different from communicating other areas, other cultures, or whatever? Let me say some hypotheses here. First hypothesis: science, natural sciences at least, are extremely difficult to communicate because they change all the time. Isn't your area changing from month to month, year to year, whatever? An example here, a biological example, the concept of apoptosis was discovered named, not discovered, in 1992 or 93, I believe, in C. elegans, the pathway and so forth. So let's suppose you were giving a lecture on the biography of a cell in 1989. You would tell a story. Now you've given the same lecture in 1995. You would tell another story. And people don't buy that. You told me something, now you're telling me something else. How come? And we had something very recently about that. Didn't that happen during COVID? Remember in the very first month of COVID, that very well-respected immunologists or virologists, sorry, would say, wash your hands with chlorine or whatever, or wash everything. And then maybe a couple of months later, they would come and say, no, continue washing your hands. But now we know it's airborne. So now open the windows. That backfired because people said, you told me something, now you're telling me something else. So that's one of the perils of doing science communication, that it changes sometimes so fast that people won't buy what we are saying. Second hypothesis, science is difficult to communicate because it's difficult, right? Another example, let's talk about systems biology, right? Like not studying 20 neurons, but 20,000 neurons, or 15 genes, but 50,000 genes. Let me show you a definition of systems biology. Systems biology is a new field for biology that aims at developing a system-level understanding of biological systems. Of course, right? Well, that's from an MIT. It's an old book. That's from the MIT. Right? It's nonsense. It's circular. It's tautological.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, but we love it, right? Because we go to the park and say this, and everybody will say, oh, look at the scientists. And that's wrong. I mean, not because of the technical or the jargon part of it, but because it's circular, it doesn't say anything. And if we like to talk difficult like this, of course, we like to show difficult icons. Last biological example, right? After we learned about the human genome, we talked about the human proteome, and then came the connectome, right? And I was actually at a conference for a massive audience of somebody talking about the connectome and showing this. There you go. I love it, right? That's only understandable for the people that work on this cluster, on this cells, this is cancer cell or whatever. But 10 people or whatever, because it's for a conference, for a scientific conference, not for a general audience. Actually, when there's a story by Sir Arthur Eddington, the astronomer, that kind of demonstrated the theory of relativity when he measured light during an eclipse, the position of a star. And there is an interview to Eddington, I don't know if it's true, in which the journalist asks him, is it true that the theory of relativity is only understandable by 3 people? And the answer was, who is the third? Right? So we love that. We love that we are the holders of the truth. And it's not true. Another reason, another hypothesis for this is something that we all know, but it's very difficult to communicate, right? Which is that our brain is inductivist, right? And this is Karl Popper, of course. We see a white swan, another one. Our brain is usually saying that all swans are white, but science is always looking for the other thing, the null hypothesis. That we do an experiment to disprove our hypothesis. That's very difficult to communicate to people, and we pretend that it's everyday business, and it's not. So it's difficult to make people passionate and understand that we're doing something, not to prove something, but to disprove something, right? Another example of why is science so difficult to communicate is that what reaches our audiences are news, and we don't have news. I'm sure that you have been called by a journalist, and he or she will ask you, what's new? What's a new discovery? Nothing, right? What we have is stories, quite long stories that we probably inherited from our mentor, and hopefully our students will get, and so forth, right? And this is one of my wonderful examples. It's a movie which it's from the 70s, I believe. It's The Return of the Two-Headed Monster. Did you see that one? Or you don't know what you've lost, you know? So there's a transplant of heads, right? And this is a very bad scientist. I'll conquer the world and so forth. And his head is transplanted into another body of a prisoner that is on death row and so forth. but there are two things that go wrong. One is that they don't take the head out of the prisoner, they keep it and they put the scientist on the shoulder, right? So there's a scene in which the scientist wakes up and say, I did it, I will conquer the world. And he looks up. It's a wonderful story. Let's suppose that happened, that we had a head transplant. What would say the news after that? Well, they have the two-headed monster. And that's the news, yeah. But what's the story about that? Can you really do that? Can you put together nerves? Can you put together arteries, veins? If you do a head transplant or a brain transplant, are you transplanting a brain into another body or a body into the brain? And those are the real stories. But journalism usually goes for the news. And the story, which is the real science, doesn't fit in there. Another example, and just a couple more. When we tell science stories, we usually tell them as if they happened today or yesterday or last week, right? Not with a historical perspective. Remember when this might have happened to you, when in high school or at some point, you were talking about the theory of evolution, and your teacher would talk about Lamarck, yeah? And of course, they would use the giraffe example. And what we would do, we would laugh out. Yeah? Oh, he was such a stupid guy. He was thinking that the neck of the giraffe was going to get tall, so the little giraffes would have a taller neck or whatever. And we would believe, well, that's nonsense. What an idiot he was, right? That was what happened in my class. Why? Because we are thinking about Lamarck today, not in the 18th century, late 18th century, right? When he was one of the first ones that was saying animals change, right? And that's not something that we do when we communicate science. We don't do theory of mind. You don't get into scientists' minds to see what they were thinking, right? We don't get into Lamarck's mind or Newton's or Lavoisier. No, Lavoisier better not, right? Don't get into Lavoisier head. No chemists. What happened with Lavoisier? How did he die? Yeah, of course that. Good, thank you, Andres. Bad joke, okay? Last one, yeah, and I want to stop a little bit on this one, is that the science that we tell people usually has nothing to do with their everyday lives. Maybe it doesn't, but there's usually some side that we can take advantage of. And that's what I like to call smuggling science, right? Telling science stories when people don't expect them. If you tell them, well, this is my last experiment, they will run away. You'll end in the bar by yourself, right? In the table by yourself. But you tell them, I'm going to tell you about soccer, I'm going to tell you about music, I'm going to tell you about literature, about cooking or whatever. Oh, that's something I'm interested in. Well, now let me tell you the science about it. So let's see a few examples of that, this smuggling science, right? One that usually happens, and it's very risky for me to do it. I know it's 2:30 or something like that in the afternoon. It's this one, right? What will happen with all of you? I won't get mad. Right? This is a wonderful starting conversation for a science lecture or whatever, because everyone will start yawning, right? So why? And then people will get interested. Oh, I never thought about that. You know? Why is it contagious? And so forth. You know, there is a scientific society for yawning. Yes, your taxes. Yes, I mean, and they have a conference. The last one was in Paris 2 years ago. It was so boring. You know, oh, doctor, boring. But it's a real scientific question. We don't know. The answer is that we have no idea, right? The last idea is that yawning has to do with refrigerating blood that goes into the brain. It was what Aristotle would have said, right? But people will get interested here. And then let's go into our houses. What happens in the kitchen? Of course, lots of science, right? You put some lemon into your tea and the color changes a lot. Remember when you were in high school and you hated acids and bases and so forth? Well, that's what's happening in your tea. Or your bread is changing color because you're toasting it. Well, that's a very complex reaction that chemists study. And we don't use that as an excuse for telling science stories. Let's continue touring our house. Let's see what happens in the bathroom. And let me ask you, who of you sing while they're taking a bath or a shower? Okay, just a few of you. Let me change the question. How many of you take baths or showers? Is that usual from Seattle?
Yes.
Let's suppose you would take showers. Let's assume, as an economist would say, let's assume that. Would you like to sing Did you ever hear somebody singing? Yes, of course. Why? Why do people sing when they're in the bathroom? And that's a scientific question, right? And then you can bring a physicist in, an expert in acoustics and so forth. I mean, in the bathroom, of course, we all sound wonderful. We are all Gabel, we would say in Argentina, right? Why? Because of the size, because of the tiles and so forth. And that's a wonderful opening way of telling whatever your science is. What we do with Horacio, Eric, and many people here, I mean, science in the bedroom. People are amazed at what happens at night, every night in their bedroom. And I said every night, so no. Right? I mean, when you start talking about sleep, about dreams, about rapid eye movement or whatever, people are absolutely amazed because that happens to them. It doesn't only happen in the lab. And from there you can go to the lab. Or talking about whatever, music. I mean, you ask people to imagine a melody without lyrics, right? And then you ask people, so is that melody happy or sad? It's a lot more happy or sad. It's nothing, right? It's a bunch of notes and silences. What happens with the brain that tells you that it's happy or sad? And then you have the audience in your hands and you can go into the details of the science. You can go to science in the body. For example, this amazing paper called Nail Growth, 35 years of observation. Isn't that great? By a certain Dr. Bean, I don't know if this is true. You know what this guy did for 35 years of his life? He will write down. And this is materials of and methods of the paper, right? This is true. So with a Sharpie, he would draw a line at the bottom of the nail and wait until the line goes to the tip of the finger. So you have space and time. That's speed, right? Well, that's what scientists do. Well, isn't that a real scientific question? Can you measure easily how muscles grow? No, it's not that easy. Can you measure easily how bones grow? No. Can you measure how hair grows? No. A very long time ago. But you can measure nails. And then you talk about how the body is changing and so forth, and you have the audience. But this is the good side of the coin. Of course, the urgent times, there's also bad science that can be communicated, right? First, some things are lies, and they get communicated and they get spread much faster than real news, and we'll talk about very briefly. Then we don't take into account cognitive biases. Well, this is true because I heard it and 10 people told me about this, right? Or the confirmation bias. I mean, I believe something, then somebody comes and tells me something that is in favor of what I believe, I will consider that as true, right? But on the other hand, if what you tell me does not relate to what I believe, that is false. And that's how our mind works. And we have to take that into account when we communicate, right? And as I said a while ago, the authority principle, right? This is not the best way of communicating. This is true. A scientist is telling you this, right? So there are many ways of coping with this. Sagan gave us a wonderful way in his last book, in Science is a Candle in Light, in the Dark, sorry. He wrote this baloney detector kit. I urge you to read it. It's really good for teaching and also for our own science, right? And of course for science communication, which is, I mean, if there's no independent confirmation, well, authority carries it away. Spin more than one hypothesis. Do not get attached to a hypothesis just because it's yours. I know that rings a bell in many of you. Maybe it does. It's a wonderful piece. It's available everywhere, so I urge you to read it. There are also some posters on the baloney detection kit, which is really good. Okay, we know that, but does it happen? Not really. Look at this, right? This is a PLOS ONE article. I know it was a few years ago. The studies that are mostly reported by newspapers are the ones that are less replicable because they're wonderful. I mean, you have a one-hit wonder, and journalists will look at that and say, "That's what I need to tell the audience," right? And then nobody can replicate it, but it's too late. Right? It's the same as retracting a paper. Nobody retracts an article in the newspaper like we do retract, or some journalists retract. So this is something we'd have to take a look about. Finally, let's talk about modern times. And we have a tragic recent experiment that was incredible for science communication, which was, of course, the pandemic. Right? It was incredible what was happening there. And people were very interested in this, right? Should we use the pandemic for doing more science communication or health communication, like this paper says? In some cases it was used, in some cases it wasn't. Also, during the pandemic, we learned that the ways in which information is spreading nowadays is not the best ways. There was a science paper also around, it was before the pandemic, I have to say, in which they created a series of fake Twitter messages, and compared them to a series of real messages with real information. Well, the ones that were fake, right, and this is a wonderful paper, would reach more people, right, and would be faster in reaching more people, but exponentially faster. So there's something about fake news and the way of telling science stories when they are fake, and we know they are fake, that is very it's really appealing for the audience. We have to be absolutely careful about this. Also, during the pandemic, there were some experiments which could compare traditional news media, newspapers, respectable newspapers or journals and so forth, and social media. And the results are incredible. Take a look at this, right? Here you can see the green here is real news with some scientific data that could change throughout time. And the red here depicts the fake news about, for example, you need to take lots of vitamin C so the virus won't infect you. Well, if this was conveyed on Twitter, well, it spread a lot, but it was on the newspapers, it wasn't, right? And so forth, conspiracy theories. If you eat bats, you know, you will get infected. If that is on Twitter, it will spread much more and much faster and so forth. And not only this, it's not only what people would think, but what they would do with the information. Here, it's the effect on outcome, right? Like, for example, the outcome was, if you read some news, would you do social distancing or not, right? Social distancing here is the green dot, right? What happened if you read something on social media? Well, you would not get social distance. So if you went for traditional news, really good ones, the traditional with science writer and so forth, maybe the response would be to get more social distance. So there is an actual effect of doing good science communication, and you can measure that, right? Then, of course, there were lots of conspiracy theories during the pandemic, and people have studied that. We did a very short study in Argentina about this, and it's very similar to what they found. You could predict who would buy conspiracy theories in terms of psychological profiles, right? There's some profiles that are much more prone for this, and you have to be careful about that because that's real people, that's out there, right? And again, during the pandemic, we had lots of authority principle news. For example, at the start of the pandemic, the French Ministry of Health was saying that you shouldn't take ibuprofen, cortisol, and so forth, because they would aggravate infection. I know what people are so worried about ibuprofen and acetaminophen and things like that. You know, it always happens. If you need a culprit, you go to this kind of things. But he was the health minister saying this. So that's principle of authority, right? He probably knows about it. Finally, and I hope we can have some time for questions and discussion, everything I told you about is how should we, it's not that we need to do science communication. I think we all agree we need to do it, but how to do it, how it works, and how to do science of science communication. Do experiments, see what works, what people believe, what they don't. And that's a matter of tactics and strategy. And coming from the southern cone, and this reminds me a lot of a wonderful guy from Uruguay, who is this guy. Some of you might know him. He was a Uruguayan writer called Mario Benedetti, and he wrote a poem called Tactics and Strategy. And I invite you to read this poem with the eyes of science communication. Let's see. My tactic is to look at you, to learn how you are, to love you as you are. Well, that's not deficit, right? I'm not watching you from above. I want to learn how you are and love you as you are. My tactic is to talk to you and listen to you and construct with words an indestructible bridge. That's what we need to do with science communication, not fear people away or not proving our superiority, but construct a bridge. They probably know things that we don't. So it's a bidirectional bridge for sure. My tactic is to remain in your memory. I don't know how, nor on what pretext, but to remain in you. I mean, when we do science communication, what's the success? That's going to be the story that the family will be discussing during dinner, right? So we want to keep our story in their memory. So my tactic is to be honest. mean, when we do science communication, we need to know that what we are saying is as good as we can, because we are the experts or we talk to the experts. So we are honest about it. And to know that you are honest and that we don't sell each other fakes, right? What we were talking about a while ago. So between the two of us, there's neither a curtain nor an abyss. So finally, what about the strategy? My strategy is, by contrast, more profound and more simple. My strategy is that one fine day, I don't know how nor on what pretext, you'll finally need me, and they will actually need us. Thank you. Oh, that's it. Good thing. I mean, sorry.
So we have, I mean, it's o'clock already, but we
Yeah.
can stay and answer questions. And I can take questions from the Zoom audience via the chat. That's probably going to be the easiest way.
Please, Eric. Yeah. Yes.
And really stimulating in a lot of ways. You introduced me to a lot of concepts that I didn't think about before. And I think that you're not a big fan of social media in some ways.
In some ways.
When you think about the goal is to communicate, what do you think the role of things like podcasts and Wikipedia are? Maybe they're similar or maybe they're different.
Okay. I think they're very different. I wouldn't.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question is, what do we think, or what do you think about vehicles like podcasts or Wikipedia? I think they're very different, really. I would place podcast in the relatively new digital media. Well, Wikipedia, even though it's on the computer and it's wiki, so people will correct it, it's a very old way of communicating. It's an encyclopedic way of communicating, right? The other one, it's not that I'm not a fan of social networks or digital media, in which I include podcasts. It's because I'm not of the right generation, probably, and I admire the younger people that use it wonderfully well, but there are not that many. And if you go into podcasts, some are amazing, probably the most well-known, and lots of them are rubbish. Really, and they have no control over what they say. The same happens with TikTok or Instagram, whatever. The ones that we know and that we share are, oh, this is wonderful, but that's one in thousands probably that are not really good. So it's a bit troublesome, and I don't go much deeper into that because I don't manage those formats very well. I use social networks, I do podcasts and so forth, but I'm not in the right generation, I believe, for that. I admire my students that do that, and they teach me how to do it, but I'm not the right person for it. That's why I write books. Yes, please.
Do you have resources into how we can better science communicators that we can look into?
There's lots, really lots. There are some podcasts. There are associations of science communicators that are amazing. Some publishers have very good sites like SciDev, which is managed by Science, Nature, and somebody in Europe, I don't remember who. The Open Notebook is one of the best ones, who has really solid advice for scientists wanting to do this. And then there's the getting into the discipline itself. I mean, there are manuals and books and so forth. I'm teaching a course on science communication right now here in the US. And the last lecture, we invited Carl Zimmer. I don't know if you know Carl Zimmer. He's a science writer for the New York Times, amazing guy. And in an hour, he gave us so many tools for our science students that it was incredible, right? In just 1 hour of lecture. So there's a lot out there, and I can certainly come up with a list of things that I can recommend, the ones that I know out of the many that are out there. But if you want to go to the Open Notebook, that's really good. There are two styles here, right? There's the Scientific American style and the New Scientist style of science communication. Scientific American articles are written by scientists, right? With a lot of help with science communication. The New Scientist style is that the articles are written by journalists, but they're science journalists that have been trained for decades here. It's very different. Between those two, I prefer New Scientists, because they allow themselves for some humor, for some fiction, characters, and whatever, we do not allow ourselves to do that, usually, and I like that, but it's a matter of things.
Thank you.
When you were talking about the stories of science, I get that a lot of what those stories talk about is the outcome of science.
Yes.
And I think like the
You're right.
method of science is
You're right.
another very important way of like thing that we need to communicate.
Yeah.
So how can we do that?
I completely agree, and that's why I quit journalism. You don't have space nor time in journalism to tell how you arrived to that outcome. In the newspaper, it's very, unless you are Carl Zimmer or Gina Colada or the big names, which in just, 1,000 words, they can tell about the method. In most places, you won't find it, right? That's why I like books. That's why I like TV shows, maybe some podcasts and so forth, because you have the time for doing that. So as scientists, if we want to write a science story for a newspaper, we won't like it because we will think that we left out everything that matters. Maybe we're right. Write a book or not a book. Okay, write something longer or with your students, you can do a video, not a 1-minute video for TikTok, but a 10-minute video. Okay, a bit of the method can go in there. Again, it's my personal stories. I left journalism to go into communication because I wanted to tell exactly what you're saying. The methods and how we arrive to a certain principle, temporary truth or whatever. Journalism that usually does not allow.
I have a question from the Zoom. This is from Eric Chandler, himself a great
I know,
communicator.
yeah.
He has a Grammy, actually. You don't have a Grammy yet.
I don't like that question.
So the question is, how do we convince our supervisors, university administrators, that science communication is important?
It's the Röntgen example. I read something about how science communication helps you finance science if you do it on the right way. If you don't do it, you won't get anything. You won't get money nor good people. If you do it, that's not, of course, guaranteed. But there is a paper there in which they compared financing and the kind of money that institutions get together with communication. And the other one is, there is a study by a French guy who, there's also the idea that people that communicate a lot, the Sagan effect, they're not good scientists. That's why they do it, right? Or they spend a lot, in my case, I'm not a great scientist, but I do spend a lot of time doing communication, right? This guy actually did something, a bibliometric assay in which the scientists that would appear more on the news, not only because they are quoted, but because they talk on the news, they usually have higher H indexes and publish better and so forth. And that's real data, the one that we want to convey to our community and to our administrators. I don't know how it works here, but I think that's the only way, showing data. If you communicate more, you'll do better science, you get better students, better faculty, and probably more money.
And just, a comment about the Grammy. Diego had several TV programs in Argentina of science, popularization of science, so he could get a Grammy. So, yeah, any more questions from the audience or the Zoom? Very good. So
Well,
thank you all
so
for
much.
coming.
Thank you.